Hello and welcome to the fourth of 5 Convergent Performance Linx webinars for 2018. I'm Captain Chris Lutat, founding partner here at Convergent Performance and author of Automation Airmanship. The topic for today's training is Fly First, controlling the flight path when the unexpected happens. Let's start with answering just a couple of questions. First, how well did you rise to the July challenge of reducing flight path deviations by 50%? Well, the data's in. It looks like we did a pretty good job. We actually got very, very close to our stated goals to drive down flight path deviations by 50%. We're still looking at the data, but the hard work that you did in the cockpit really reduced the likelihood of flight path deviations. But what's more is, have you adopted those habit patterns, those techniques, and applied those consistently, even though the challenge is over? Second question, was that just a one-time fire and forget, now we're done fire drill? Of course it wasn't. The answer to that is simple, absolutely not. What we want to do today is add a little bit more to that training, build on what we learned and applied in July, and focus on some of the things that are becoming more and more important and receiving more focus amongst the regulators and investigators across our industry. So today's purpose, simplified, comes down to two things. First, we want to inspire refined airmanship in every Jet Linx crew member by focusing on how in-flight startle occurrences can be handled smoothly and safely. In the past few decades, our culture has adopted a saying that I've revised and refined just a little bit and made a little bit more PC for settings like this. It goes like this: the real world happens. And a corollary to that law is simply stated as, and it happens a lot more than you think. So we want to give every Jet Linx crew member a single go-to procedure that you can apply every time that the real world gets in the way of an otherwise perfectly planned flight. So let's dig in. Here are just a few scenarios where today's training is going to help you. Gust upsets close to the ground. I'm talking about the unexpected impact of the environment, normally with gusty crosswinds or gusty head and tail winds that happen close to the runway on takeoff or departure. It could be caused by the wake of an aircraft taking off before you or landing before you. It could also be caused by frontal passage or other environmental impact, maybe even winds around hangars or approach ends of the runway or the departure end of the runway that could add additional forces on the flight path of the airplane. Wake encounters in all phases of flight. None of us who have been operating for the past 6 or 7 years with the adoption across air traffic control in North America of RECAT, wake turbulence separation standards, have not encountered increased wake encounters in almost every phase of flight because of the reduced nose to tail separation that ATC has been providing. Air data and pedostatic abnormals. We'll talk a little bit about this in depth, but in an air data and pedostatic abnormal, with the loss of normally reliable information, we have to resort to flight path information provided by the platform equipment on the airplane. We'll talk about that in some detail. Unanticipated go-around situations caused by traffic or ATC are increasingly filling up ASAP reports, NASA ASRS files, and also files of investigators across our industry globally. The unanticipated go-around situation is causing across our industry high pitch, high angle of bank, and slow speed occurrences that are resulting in near disasters across our industry. How about this? A seemingly simple, routine, but last-minute runway change at a departure or destination airport. This normally is handled routinely and without much time pressure. Unless it's very close to the runway, say inside of a 12 or 10 mile final where tower asks if you can support a sidestep to another runway. Often, crews, especially in highly automated airplane, perceive this as a flight guidance and automation problem and not an airmanship problem. If we treat it that way, we are likely to get involved in an unexpected, unanticipated near startle event. And these, again, are just a few of the scenarios that you'll apply today's training in. Recent accidents over the past couple of decades, especially within the last 10 years or so, have told us a little bit about how our training across our industry has done well and is leaving us short in some key performance areas. One of the most useful quotes that I've been able to find in all of the data that the accident investigation industry has provided us is this quote from the Air France 447 final investigation report from 2012. I'd like us all to read this quietly, and then I'll read it out loud for effect. Initial and recurrent training as delivered today do not promote and test the capacity to react to the unexpected. Indeed, the exercises are repetitive and well known to crews and do not enable skills and resource management to be tested outside of this context. So what we're counted on to do is to get familiar with how well we perform and how we might respond in a true real-world startle event. Brings us back to this. We're very good at focusing on how the hardware and the software on our flight deck perform, and to a substantial event, how we're to interact with that to provide for an effective control of flight path across all phases of flight. But we're not very good categorically across the board in understanding how we're likely to respond as the wetware, you know, the carbon unit, us, in these highly unlikely, rare, and very unexpected events, also known throughout our industry as startle events. Over 110 years ago, researchers Yerkes and Dodson created the Yerkes-Dodson model, otherwise known as the stress performance curve. This information on the stress performance curve and this model of how humans respond under high stress, low time situations has been proven thousands of times in research for the last century. Take a look at the horizontal axis. That's, well, basically stress from low to high. Vertically, on the vertical axis, we have performance. So performance versus stress, and performance goes from the poor end of the scale to good. If we take a look at a typical complex task, we would expect as stress and arousal increases as we move from left to right, we would expect that our performance would increase and improve up to a certain point. Beyond that point, we end up on what I like to call the backside of the stress performance curve. When we take a simple task, we seem to perform a little bit better. Now, a simple task, that can be anything that we consider routine on the flight deck, or it could be some of those things that we've practiced so well across our training in every aircraft we've ever flown. Well, that brings to mind, say, RTOs, rejected takeoffs, go-arounds, your typical standard go-around from a low-vis approach. How about a V1 cut? Maybe even an engine-out approach and go-around. We seem to have been able, across our business, to simplify some of these very challenging flight-critical maneuvers and increase our performance in that way. But still, we can find ourselves past the point of optimum performance, where stress and performance are at their ideal optimal levels, where things aren't too hard, but too easy, and our performance is outstanding. Startle events give us a different challenge. We end up on the backside of the performance curve in an area that some researchers have called an area where we tend to perseverate. That's a fancy word. That's the same word, or that's a fancy word for the same thing that all of us have identified, maybe in ourselves or maybe in others during a high stress, low time situation, either in training or in actual line operations. We know perseveration is tunnel vision, brain lock, or fixation. At any rate, what the researchers tell us during startle events, during unexpected real world encounters that are unprepared for and and highly unusual, flight crews, the carbon unit, the wetware tends to focus most of the time on anything that happens to enter their mind first. If you perceive it as an auto flight problem, well, your solution will be along the lines of restoring effective auto flight. If it's a flight guidance problem, you might go there. If it's another suspected system failure, you might go there. All to the exclusion of the one thing that we should do above all else, and that's fly the airplane. Restoring the flight path, slowing things down, doing one thing at a time, and ultimately getting on the front side of the stress performance curve. I think we can all identify with this. Increasingly, research has shown that we perform poorly and need to focus on the one thing when we're on the backside of the stress performance curve. So this leads us to the one single go-to procedure that can make all the difference in assuring your flight path and the safety of your passengers and crew. When you're unsure of the flight guidance and auto flight information that's being displayed, fly first. Stabilize the flight path. Now, I know a lot of you, just like myself, came up in a flight training environment where the old adage, aviate, navigate, communicate, in that order, was beat into our skulls by our instructors. In the 21st century airspace that we work in, on the 21st century flight deck, we need to simplify that to the exclusion of the second step and the third step, leave those for later, and simply fly first. After you've restored the flight path of the airplane, only after that should you comply with the clearance, communicate with ATC, and finally address the aircraft configuration. And crews that I am surrounded with, when I train and evaluate, I will often tell them, I don't care. I truly don't. If you get the missed approach holding fix with your gear and your flaps down, so long as you have not violated the clearance, overstressed the airplane, or caused a reduction in separation with other aircraft. Now that's kind of hard to do every time that an unexpected go around is thrust on the crew. We'll talk about that in a few minutes, but I think you get the idea. Fly the airplane first, and as we slow things down, we'll address all of those other aircraft situations. In 2008, about a year before the Air France 447 accident in the South Atlantic, where an Air France crew flew a perfectly flyable airplane with 3 perfectly functioning ring laser gyros all the way to impact on the surface of the South Atlantic. Only thing that they were missing was accurate and reliable airspeed information. 8 months before that accident, in an industry publication, Captain Dave Owens and Captain Mike Varney published this quote: "All we are left with in the time that we have to train for the most likely events and time to give general rules, procedures, and handling skills to cope with everything else. At the heart of this concept must be the principle of fly first." So we're not going to be able to train for every unlikely event in our routine and recurrent training. But we can train and we can expect of ourselves and those who we fly with the one thing that must happen during a startle or in-flight, unexpected or upset event, and that is to fly first. Now, we've worked a little bit on the wetware. We've talked about how we're likely to respond as aircrew members on the backside of the stress performance curve. Let's talk a little bit about the hardware and some of the things that you can help restore yourself to peak performance with when you find yourself in a highly unlikely, upset, unexpected encounter with startle during a flight. First of all, are you very well versed as you should be, in the autopilot and flight guidance disconnect logic of the airplane you fly? In other words, are your disconnects smooth? Are you able to disconnect and silence warnings associated with the disconnect smoothly so as not to allow for distraction on the flight deck? Sounds simple, but during startle events, a loud warning horn associated with the disconnect of the autoflight that is not smoothly silenced can impart and actually increase stress on the flight deck and slow your response to stabilizing the aircraft flight path. How about the flight control laws that your aircraft's automatic flight depend on? Now, you might not fly an aircraft that is complex enough to be built around flight control laws with respect to its auto flight and its flight guidance, but eventually you will. The best place to start the discipline that will provide you a career-spanning knowledge of this essential 21st century systems knowledge is understanding the laws and the flight control logic of the airplane that you're flying today. Now, what information on your PFD and your heads-up display are going to remain reliable with a complete loss of air data? Again, don't be a crew that flies a perfectly flyable airplane with perfectly reliable platform data into the ground when all you need to do is restore a normal pitch, a normal angle of a bank, and a nominal thrust that will keep the airplane airborne. How much of what you see in front of you on your PFD or HUD can you rely on during a complete loss of air data? Now, talk a little bit about aircraft standby instruments. Most of us have the only interaction that we'll have with the standby instruments will be during pre-flight when we check that they're properly powered and there are no flags present. Have you adopted as a matter of habit in your normal flying routine an occasional scan of your standby instruments just simply to be able to know that you will find them if you need them in a pinch? There are all kinds of scenarios that would require us to fly on standby instruments. And would you be able to locate it quickly, understand the symbology enough to stabilize the aircraft with a loss of reliable airspeed? How about flight guidance behavior during different phases of flight? Increasingly, aircraft are coming out of completion hangars around the world as phase of flight aircraft. In other words, they behave differently in phases of flight. This is not new news to most everybody at Linx. Most of our crew members know that the aircraft behaves certain ways and flight guidance can expect to be doing certain things during certain phases of flight. For example, do you understand the go-around logic so that when you are introduced to by ATC an unexpected missed approach instruction, are you able to fly through or fly around the guidance on your PFD or HUD and control the flight path to the exact cleared heading, altitude, and speed given to you by the tower or departure control? The same thing goes for takeoff, climb, and descent. This is essential knowledge. This gives you an accurate mental representation of how the flight guidance and how the auto flight is performing or needs to perform when you need to restore or degrade the aircraft's flight guidance and automation. Now, one of my favorite researchers in the industry is a man named Gary Klein, who in a book called actually the book was called, I'll send you the title of the book. But anyway, in this very important research that Mr. Klein conducted in the late 90s, his quote is, "Experts have mental models of their equipment. They're not just pressing buttons and receiving messages," which means we have to understand the background of how our automation is working and what we can expect it to present to us in all phases of flight to be effective in restoring it or working around it whenever the case requires. Pilots love checklists. And if you're going to manage startle and surprise events like an expert, here's a checklist for success. Number one, know that know that you have limits during stressful in-flight events, and you cannot be relied upon, nor can you rely upon those with you to solve complex flight guidance or auto flight issues or other aircraft systems problems when you are on the backside of the stress performance curve. You need to do the one thing, and that is to fly the airplane first. A normal pitch attitude, a normal angle of bank, and a normal nominal thrust setting will lead you back to a point where you can then engage and solve complicated problems. During any unexpected flight event, be prepared to fly first, protecting the aircraft flight path through basic flying skills. This is like restating everything that we've said so far. But I also want to add here the fact that research has shown repeatedly that the least likely pilot on the flight deck to recognize that they are not attending to the flight path of the airplane is, well, guess who? The pilot flying. As the pilot monitoring, you may be the first person that is going to see and recognize during an unexpected in-flight event that the pilot flying is not flying the airplane first. He or she may be involved in an automation solution or a flight guidance solution that they perceive to be the root of the problem, when all they simply need to do is put the airplane in a stable, nominal flight path state. Number 3, adopt and practice in-flight strategies for putting on the brakes. Allow flying, monitoring, and workload to be balanced across unexpected in-flight events. Now, in the shooting culture, namely the world of special operations, there's an adage that they use to describe what we want crews to adopt as well. I've written a couple of blogs on this in the last few years, but that adage goes like this: slow is smooth and smooth is fast. So put the brakes on, address the flight path first, and you'll find that you'll exit an unknown or unexpected startle event quicker than you might have otherwise. Another take on this is from, well, Wyatt Earp, you know, the Marshal. Soon after the OK Corral shooting, he was asked to comment on that for National Magazine, and he said, "Speed is fine in a gunfight, but accuracy is everything. You need to take your time in a hurry." I think that's great perspective, especially when you're faced with an in-flight unexpected event, such as a startle caused by any of the conditions that we mentioned earlier. Study and practice flight guidance logic. In other words, every time you go flying, you don't have to wait for recurrent training. You don't have to wait for an evaluation flight to be able to share with the other crew member that you're flying with what you know or what you'd like to know about how the aircraft auto flight and flight guidance logic behaves, so that you're more apt to see upsets before they occur, or you're more apt to be able to fly to a nominal flight state and then reconnect, reconfigure the auto flight. We can do it every time that we fly. Now, this again is not new news. This is something that you've seen several times already this year during these webinars. This is Dr. Kern's Performance Evolution Ladder. And it's a representation of where we want to be as professional pilots. If you remember, there's a point where, well, sadly, the regulators asked that we perform to, were evaluated to during our recurrent training. And unfortunately, it's the compliance line that we generally strive to maintain, but many of us fail to exceed. Unfortunately, it's also called acceptable performance in most situations. Dr. Kern calls this the crushing grip of mediocrity, right? It's where, well, I like to call this the gravitational pull of the norm, where we accept our performance even though our survival may one day depend on precise and near perfect flying. Hey, the whole point of our training has been, and our interaction and our challenge in July and challenges that we'll have in the future, and our constant reminder to add more precise flying and more precise professional approaches to your own flying is so that we can leave the norm. We can resist the gravitational pull of the norm. We can exit the crushing grip of mediocrity to keep our performance at the highest possible level. Now, our industry is going through many changes. You're on the front line of those changes. We just have to be honest with you. As you all know, the airspace is getting more congested. Autoflight is tending to get more complex over time. The pressure on crews is increasingly great across the entire system. Being able to cope with startle simply by understanding what's likely to happen to your performance during an unexpected in-flight event is a huge multiplier for your personal performance. Knowing how to recognize it in yourself and knowing how to see it in others is a great skill that will not let you down over the course of your career. Now, I always end with this slide in most of my talks, and it's particularly useful today to remind us that as technology, including the aircraft, the technology on board the aircraft, the technology in use by air traffic control, as that grows and advances and increases in its performance, we tend to stay the same. So our knowledge of how we perform when either the equipment or the system begins to break down unexpectedly is a huge performance multiplier over the course of our next flight, all of our flights this year, our next training and evaluation flight, heck, our entire career. If you'd like to know more, Automation Airmanship is available in ebook and certainly hard copy. My blog is free training that is updated periodically throughout the year. And you can always email me at clutat@convergentperformance.com. Thanks. Our next webinar will be in early October, and we'll continue the training. And we hope to hear from you before then so that we can continue to exceed the expectations with JetLinx. Thanks very much. Fly safely.